Behold the mighty kidney. Now, when I was asked to do this talk, I was getting a little tired of doing talks on the ventilator and the lungs and the heart and shock, because we kind of do that all the time. And granted, that's what we spend a lot of our time worrying about during a transport. But I thought today we would go in a little bit of a different direction, and I'd talk about some of the other lesser known kidney or organs like the kidney and the liver. And I talk today about the mighty kidney, because let's admit it, you probably don't really know how the kidney works or everything that it does. It makes pee, and for some people it makes stones. But what else? Well, there is actually a bunch of stuff that the kidneys do. It maintains water balance, maintains acid-base balance, it maintains all of your electrolyte balances. It also has a number of very important hormonal functions. It controls your blood pressure through a variety of different mechanisms. It also makes erythropoietin, which is kind of important when you've been bitten by the saber-toothed tiger. Also, it is also responsible for helping synthesize vitamin D. So these are all really important but lesser known functions of the kidneys. Basically, the kidney just maintains homeostasis. This is the organ that is responsible for letting you go to the movie theater. Because when you go to the movies, you buy a big tub of popcorn and it's really salty and delicious, and a huge bottle of pop, or sometimes something a little less family friendly. And you consume all of that within an hour. And instead of exploding from the consequences of a massive fluid and salt balance, the only thing that feels like it's about to explode is your bladder. And that's because the kidney helps maintain that homeostasis and allows you to do the things you like to do. So how does the kidney work? That's not really magic. And when you look at the kidney under the microscope, you can see that it is composed of just a bunch of nephrons. And nephrons are essentially the functional unit of the kidney. A nephron is composed of the glomeruli, which blood goes into. There's a filtration system, and then urine comes out and goes into the tubules. Now, this sounds pretty simple, but it gets complicated very, very quickly. So to start, I want to actually dial it back a little bit and keep it simple for you so that you understand how the kidney works. So to make a kidney, basically all you need is a strainer and some sponges. Now let's start with the strainer, or glomeruli, if you will. Now a good strainer keeps big stuff in and lets small things out. And these small things include things like water, salt, sugar, amino acids, all of the things that are dissolved in the water. So when you look at a nephron under the microscope and look at the glomeruli, you can see that it is basically a capsule covering a tuft of blood vessels. And these blood vessels are where the strainer function works. When you look at the blood vessels under the microscope, you can see that it is basically a bunch of holes in it, like a strainer. Now, once the fluid goes through the blood vessel and under pressure is forced across the strainer, forced across the holes, this proto-urine goes into the tubules. Now the next stop for the proto-urine is the proximal tubules, which is where it goes for further processing. So how are these tubules like sponges, like I just referred to them? Well, basically what you have at this point is this proto-urine, which is not really quite ready to go out into the bladder because it contains water, salt, glucose, amino acids, a ton of stuff that you don't actually want to lose. So you need to find a way to get all of that back. But you can't just use a regular sponge, because a regular sponge would just sop up all the good stuff and also all the bad stuff that you didn't want to begin with. So your sponge needs to be smart. So now how do you get a smart sponge? Well, if you look at the tubule cells, the individual cells themselves under a microscope, you can see that the entire membrane is covered with these things called ion channels. Channels are basically the bouncers of the cell. They allow some things to flow across their concentration gradient while keeping other things out. So if you think about the channel and the membrane, the urine and the membrane separating it from inside the cell, like a bouncer at a bar, the channel will allow things to cross across the membrane and come into the cell from the urine as long as there's a concentration gradient. Now this is all well and good, and it brings in all of the regular patrons like you want, but once the concentration gradient is equal on both sides, basically the bar is full and there's no more diffusion, so there's no more coming across, which may be fine for some things. But what if you want to get more, or in fact everything, out of the urine and into the cell? So for example, you want glucose to come, you don't want to lose any of the glucose into your urine. I mean, that's energy, and you don't want to lose any of the amino acids. I mean, that's for building the cells. You got to get it all back. But if you just use a regular channel, it's going to flow across its concentration gradient, and once they equalize on both sides, the bouncer says no more people can come in. So how can you get everything in? Well, just like in a bar, if you want to get in and the bar's kind of full, the best way to get in is bring a hot chick. And in this case, sodium is your hot chick. Now sodium, wherever you go throughout the body, always is operating on its own constant. There's always a concentration gradient for flow into the cell for sodium. And so the body takes advantage of this fact by pairing the sodium concentration gradient with another concentration, with another substance like glucose, and saying, okay, if you want to get all the glucose in and there's no concentration gradient for it, then what you do is you pair it with the sodium, which always has a concentration gradient. That bar always wants to bring the hot chicks in, and as a cost, you pair those two, and so now when the sodium comes in, it brings a glucose in with it. So now you've got everything that you want back inside the cell, but you still have a whole mess of water. You got to sop up all this extra water, and unless you want to pee about, I don't know, 1.5 liters a minute, you got to get back some of that water that's been filtered across. And this is the job for the loop of Henle. Now the loop of Henle is really clever. This is pretty neat. So the way your nephron is built, the loop of Henle comes off of the proximal tubule, off of the glomeruli, and then the loop dives deep down into the darkest recesses of the kidney, right down into the depths. And in these depths, the fluid and the tissue surrounding the loops is all really, really salty or really hyperosmolar. And so as the urine is flowing down into this tubule, into this deep dark recess, the water is experiencing an osmotic push. It needs to get out of the urine and go back into this interstitial space because it's really hyperosmolar out there, and it needs to dilute that out because that's its concentration gradient. So water is basically forced out of the tubule into this hyperosmolar state. Now, you're probably now thinking, well, okay, Smarty Pants, how do you get that? Well, this is the really clever part. See, now as the urine makes the turn and starts heading back up the loop, back towards the distal tubules, at this portion, the cells are impermeable to water. So water can't get out, but salt can. And now the urine at this point in time has a really, really high concentration gradient for salt to go out of the cell. And so now salt, or sodium chloride, is being pumped out of the urine and into the interstitial space, but water can't follow it because the membranes are impermeable to water. So this maintains that saltiness in that depth of the kidney and allows you to reabsorb water. This is pretty darn clever, if you ask me. Now, kidneys are gentle creatures, and they're easy to hurt. Fortunately, they're pretty forgiving, but you can injure them with minimal insult. The way we usually categorize renal failure or acute kidney injury is by categorizing it into intrinsic renal failure and post-renal failure. Now, and post-renal failure are kind of similar. So we're going to talk about those together, and then we'll dive deep into the intrinsic renal failure. Pre-renal failure is pretty easy to understand. Basically, if you have a loss of blood pressure or a loss of fluid, blood going into the glomeruli is at a lower pressure, and that lower pressure can't push fluid through and across the membrane, across the strainer, and so you get a fall off on your filtration. And if you get that fall off, you don't get rid of all of your toxins, and they build up in your system. Now, the kidney, it actually doesn't like to call that pre-renal failure. It's actually, to hit, it's pre-renal success. Because when the kidney experiences a drop in blood pressure, it assumes that you're being eaten by a tiger, because, I mean, that's for 10,000 years, that's what was the case. And so the kidney at that point wants to maintain total body fluid as much as possible and also divert blood away from non-essential organs. And right now, the kidney, not terribly essential. So the body clamps down on the artery and decreases the blood flow even further. The solution for pre-renal failure is pretty easy. Replace the blood or give them fluid, whatever you think they need. Now, post-renal failure kind of follows on to the same concept in that whatever goes into the kidney has to come out. So blood goes in through a renal artery, then it comes out through a renal vein, and then as a result of this, urine is going down through the ureter. So post-renal failure occurs when there's a blockage in the output from the kidney. So simply put, the ureter, when it gets plugged off, either by a trauma or a kidney stones or a very angry prostate, fluid backs up from the collecting system, and it pushes back against the glomeruli, and this back pressure acts as an opposing pressure against filtration, and it stops filtration. And so filtration goes down, toxins build up, and the patient suffers renal failure. The other way you can develop a post-renal failure is by compression or restriction on the renal vein, because blood going in has to come out. Now, if there's a case of trauma or intra-abdominal hypertension, this pressure can directly squeeze onto the renal vein that's coming out of the kidney. And this direct pressure on the renal vein basically stops any flow out. And you don't need to have a degree in plumbing to know that if you stop flow coming out, eventually flow going in is also going to stop. The other way that renal vein obstruction or restriction can cause renal failure is actually further upstream. People who develop right heart failure, right heart infarcts, pulmonary hypertension, things that increase the pressure on the right side of the heart, this back pressure is felt in the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava, when it's at higher pressures, also is a restriction to flow out of the renal vein into the inferior vena cava. So when people have chronic right heart failure or pulmonary hypertension, if their condition becomes acutely worse, we see an increase in their creatinine because the back pressure along the renal vein, along the inferior vena cava into the renal vein has decreased filtration. Now, this isn't something that usually happens acutely, but it will happen in the context of acute on chronic renal failure. So it's something to watch out for when you see patients who have these types of conditions. Now, lastly, intrinsic renal failure is the one that most of us get confused by quickly because there are a lot of different causes, and this is really the raison d'etre of the nephrologist, and they have a ton of really complex names and categorizations and way of describing it. And so to try to keep it simple for you, there are really two types of intrinsic renal failure we should consider. Those that affect the glomeruli and those that affect the tubules. Now, diseases that affect the glomeruli fall into the general category of glomerulonephritises. A glomerulonephritis is inflammation of the glomeruli. A lot of these are due to some form of an autoimmune attack. This may be a direct antibody attack on the kidney itself, like in Goodpasture's or Wegener's disease, or it can be a consequence of an autoimmune process elsewhere in the body, like a post-streptococcal glomerular nephritis, where antibodies form elsewhere and then lodge in the kidneys because the filtering action of the glomeruli and the lodging of those antibodies leads to inflammation developing locally. Basically, what ends up happening is the glomeruli holes get bigger, and as they get bigger, things that you wanted to keep in start getting out. So into the urine, you start to see red blood cells, white blood cells, and protein. So when you look at the urine under the microscope, you'll see red blood cells, and you dip it and there'll be protein present, is an indication that the glomeruli has been injured. And when you look at the urine directly, it looks pretty dirty. And for the most part, the amount of urine output goes down, but it's unusual for a glomerular nephritis to occur acutely to cause like complete anuria. The second cause of intrinsic renal failure that's important to know is called acute tubular necrosis. Now, this is the conditions that affect the tubule cells themselves. The tubular cells are very energy reliant. These are the cells in the body, in the kidneys, that are doing all of the heavy lifting. The glomeruli is just a dumb strainer. Just fluid goes through under pressure, fluid comes out. That's not hard. It doesn't take a lot of energy to generate the protourine. But getting all of the good stuff back takes a lot of energy. And so that's the part of the kidney that's really sensitive to any sort of ischemia, hypoxic injury, and can cause the kidney to go down from that. And this is the condition that leads from severe pre-renal failure. This is the exacerbation of that. If somebody has pre-renal failure within the first day, that's pretty easy to fix. Give them back fluid, problem goes away. But if you let them remain in pre-renal failure too long, they develop acute tubular necrosis as a result. So the most important thing that can cause and affects the tubules is anoxia, hypoxia, and ischemia. But other things can cause tubular damage, such as myoglobin or nephrotoxins like aminoglycosides. And there's a long list of things that are nephrotoxic, and most of these do affect the tubular cells. But I don't want to get too much into the details there. If you know that something's nephrotoxic, chances are it's probably a direct effect on the tubular cells themselves. Now, these tubular cells, when they die, fall into the urine, and these all start to form plugs that plug up the tubules. And when you look at the urine from a patient with ATN under a microscope, you can actually see the dead bodies of these cells formed into these things that we call casts. There are casts of the tubules themselves. And when you see these kinds of casts under a microscope, you know that you're dealing with ATN. Okay, so let's recap. Basically, you probably have underappreciated kidneys. Until today, now you know how incredibly important they are. Kidneys are basically groups of nephrons. Each nephron has a blood supply, a filtering capsule, and then a length of tubing for further processing. The filter lets water and small molecules through while keeping in cells and protein. The tubule cells first sop up all the good stuff like glucose and salts, and then the tubules reabsorb the remaining water while letting all the bad stuff through. Kidneys are gentle and they're very easily hurt. They can be hurt by a lack of blood supply or an obstruction to the blood's flow or the urine flow. Nephrons can also be injured by many different things. Most importantly is tubular necrosis due to ischemia. Thanks for watching, and until next time, we'll cover the function of the liver. Bye for now.